Hi, my name is Brooke Springer, and my project was over the negative effects that domestic violence has on children. Going through this presentation, there will be introduction, and then we'll introduce the problem as well. I have a literature review, the methods of the project investigation, the results or findings, a discussion on the results. There will be an evaluation of the project and the limitations that I ran into during this project, and then the recommendations from my findings. To introduce this project about domestic violence, we know that it has been occurring within households for decades now. Most people may not even be aware of the impact that it places on children who have either witnessed or been victims of this abuse. The Domestic Violence Resource Network is an organization that shines a light on this ongoing health issue while strengthening intervention and prevention efforts at all levels. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services looks further into this topic. One of the major questions that I wanted to discover was the alteration of the psychological processes, and if a child would have to deal with the effects for the rest of their lives, or if it was rather a more temporary issue. Through the extensive research studies that have been conducted over the past 20 years, there have been clear signs that domestic violence harms a child's emotional and psychological development. Each study that is listed within this article explains how violent the effects are that are being placed among the children involved in a situation as such, and how difficult it would be for them to live a normal life after an experience like this. To further introduce the problem, domestic violence has been a major issue that has been seen in healthcare dating back to the 19th century. The relevant issue to domestic violence is the way that it affects the child who has witnessed or been a victim of the abuse. While there are a variety of forms of violence present in a domestic violence household, the variety of violence includes but is not limited to physical, emotional, and mental abuse. Although all these varieties of violence can be considered domestic violence, it is important to note that there is not a significant range that depicts one form as more traumatizing than another. The only significant difference that has caused a difference in the outcomes of the life of a child is the levels that it was carried out. This includes the amount of time that the child was exposed to domestic violence and the severity of it. The longer it was carried out and the more extreme it was, the more complications they appear to have. The health complications include, but are also not limited to, behavioral impacts, social and interpersonal challenges, and the reproductive health of women exposed to domestic violence. Within this article is the explanation of these three health. Within this presentation is the explanation of these three health complications, but note that there are plenty more out there in modern society. In my literature review, I first pointed out that there are behavioral impacts that domestic violence has upon children. A meta-analysis was conducted to investigate the behavioral problems that develop within a child when violence is used in the home. The developmental review produced by Kathleen J. Sternberg, along with others, takes a different approach to how they portray the information, because it is not just listing what research has been conducted, but rather what purpose it serves as well. The deeper level of information that makes this article review so resourceful is that it covers the question of whether witnessing or being a victim of domestic violence has a severely different emotional and behavioral outcome for the child. The researchers involved in this theoretical framework explained how they found the growth, progression, and adaptations to experiences to be diminished if a child continues to live amongst violence within their home. This article even goes the extra extent into putting their view on common characteristics that they see among most abused children. These characteristics were listed as children who fail to develop interpersonal trust, receive little affection from others, or have authoritarian parents. In a similar context, the National Library of Medicine also produced a review of the psychological complications that children are prone to being exposed to. This systematic review of data shows a more evolved analytic side to the process that is involved within research studies that have produced the information. While the reader is still getting the general information from the review itself, much like previous developmental reviews, the analysts in this review break down the study that was done, who did the study, when it was conducted, and the results that were found from them. All the data was pulled from select papers produced by 2 reviewers. For example, in one of the studies done, they found that domestic violence has major impacts on verbal abilities and visual spatial abilities by causing maternal depression and the intellectual quality of the home environment. Through just these 2 articles, we already see that research shows that domestic violence has a major impact on a child's behavior. And while there is still being research done today, because of how many different scenarios fall under domestic violence and how this is a side of healthcare that may never be resolved. Domestic violence continues to affect children in a very negative manner, and another aspect of life that is diminished within these kids is their ability to face social and interpersonal challenges. Within this factor, there was an article published by Al-Majali in 2019 that compiles information from 49 other sources and takes the reader through the tasks that they were set to evaluate the effect that violence in the home has on a child's socio-psychological adaptation. Some methods were very specific to how they were going to obtain information from a questionnaire methodology made by Rogers Diamond. Majali admits to there being a limited selection in the survey, being that it was only conducted in one university and that the need for more diversified demographic wasn't taken into consideration. Even though the focus is to understand how children are affected by domestic violence, a clear picture will be made if a researcher were also to understand how women play in this role. And this is how my topic of how women are also affected by domestic violence plays into. So as the discussion on DV continues to repeat itself, it is crucial to identify that the outcomes of a woman's life is also very important. The women who are involved in a domestic violence situation could have their lives severely altered just by staying in this type of relationship. The National Library of Medicine covers the topic in a multitude of ways. This review article published by them clearly and concisely discussed how domestic violence is not only a visible physical issue, but also a high factor in reproductive morbidity. The article only provides us with studies that were conducted in North India, though, so it left a lot of assumption in the context of a global standpoint. Another discussion that was mentioned in this article clears the question as to why many women experience such gynecological issues, this being that the men, which would be the perpetrators in this situation, are prone to having sex outside of marital partner, leading to more STDs. Continuing this topic of women, is a big question that is commonly asked. Why do they stay? This is briefly discussed in an article titled Addressing Domestic Violence Against Women, an Unfinished Agenda. While investigating these similar concepts across many other articles, it is common that the women who have experienced this type of relationship find it very hard to get themselves out once they're in. This type of reaction comes as a surprise to others who have never experienced something like this, and often ends in a negative reaction when the information is disclosed to others. But many researchers have discovered explanations as to why leaving is so difficult. In articles like one titled Help Seeking Amongst Women Survivors of Domestic Violence, a qualitative study of pathways toward formal and informal support. Researchers like Maggie A. Evans explains the three most common themes that pose as a barrier to disclosing their domestic violence relationship to family or friends. These three themes were listed as self-perception, past relationship experience, and fear of repercussions of disclosure. This gives a clear understanding as to why women aren't comfortable disclosing information for fear that will be further victimization against them. So, between the two articles published through the National Library of Medicine, we were able to gain a deeper knowledge about how women are just as important to discuss in terms of domestic violence as the children who are affected as well. From each of these articles explained to every research study that has been conducted, there has been a significant impact on a child's behavior along with the social aspect of their life. How a child is affected by just witnessing domestic violence does not include the research of how mothers are affected as well. A mother going through violence and abuse during her pregnancy can also have a life-altering effect on the baby, making this information relevant to the research on how children are affected by domestic violence. Throughout my investigations, I thought that to get the best results for this project, I attacked it through researching secondary sources. I looked through journals, health reports, and articles for the answers needed within this project, and I was able to find the lasting effects that domestic violence places on a child. To accurately relate this issue to a more modern society within an ever-changing healthcare system, the information that I wanted to find needed to be discovered and published to the public within the last 20 years. Implementing women into the factor helped clear up how detrimental domestic violence is towards every individual involved, considering that it not only affects the child but the mother as well. My idea behind this project was to also understand if there was an obvious behavior of children or victims of domestic violence that is prevalent enough to be able to be spotted by others. This means that I wanted to understand just how important it would be for people within a community to be involved in training that adheres to the acknowledgement of typical behaviors of the children who have been exposed to or victimized by domestic violence. Then, after the initial factor of behavior, I was able to discover other sources that led me to research studies and articles that have been published within the last 20 years that became very valuable information for this project. The idea of women being involved in this project did not come up until a while later after discovering how negatively the reproductive health of women was affected. So my results and findings are from the literature review. So the first question, going back to that, is the focus on behavioral impacts that domestic violence has on children. There were many research tests done to answer this question, and in the same article review produced by Sternberg, developmental psychopathology research shows that family violence disrupts the typical course of growth and their adaptation to developmental issues. This is because during a certain developmental area in a child's life, the experiences that they have with their caregiver will affect how the child can adapt to similar situations in the future. In further research, the psychological adjustment from either witnessing or being a victim of domestic violence as a kid resulted in either aggression, anxiety, depression, aggressive peer relationships, poor school performance, or a host of other cognitive, social, and emotional difficulties. In this same article, there was a study conducted by Hughes, Parkinson's, and Vargo in 1989. It was concluded that a child who has witnessed domestic violence more than often has also been the victim of that same violence. These researchers found that more behavioral problems arise in a child when they experience both rather than just one form of violence within the household. In the review posted by National Library of Medicine, multiple studies were done, but the focus that is pulled from the literature review was how domestic violence affects a child's intellectual function. This study that was conducted by Hugh Box in 2001 was that the results were that domestic violence has a major impact on verbal abilities and visual spatial abilities by causing maternal depression and the intellectual quality of the home environment. Additionally, is the question of how domestic violence affects a child's social and interpersonal challenges. There are child's abuse and trauma scales, which is known as a CATS scale. As a questionnaire, these researchers were able to discover that the students with high levels of domestic violence have a low level of socio-psychological adaptability. This was actually less than 20%. However, it was found that in terms of adaptations, the group with a high level of domestic violence showed that they are more able to adapt to social situations faster, as well as forming a quality system of relations with others. The researchers involved in the study state that a child who tests low in terms of adaptability typically struggles to create social connections, which could lead to issues and aggression towards family, colleagues, and others. Acceptance was also evaluated, and it showed that individuals who have experienced a higher level of domestic violence seem to have less leniency and less positivity towards others who are not very empathic about their shortcomings. This means that these individuals have lower emotional stability and are more prone to negative emotions in comparison to others who experience a lower level of domestic violence. Finally, the last question discussed within the literature review was how women are affected by domestic violence. As mentioned, there was a study conducted in North India, and there was evidence that domestic violence had a direct correlation to a high risk of reproductive morbidity. It was also found that women involved in a DV situation found themselves more susceptible to acquiring an STD or HIV due to their abusive male partner engaging in extramarital sex. Continuing how women are affected by domestic violence, the literature review briefly explained how women found it to be extremely difficult to get themselves out of this type of situation. It was discussed that the National Library of Medicine published an article by Maggie Evans and Jean Fetter. This particular article discussed how this concept was studied by interviewing women who survived DVA to explore their experiences and the support they received. The results were found that typically these women only spoke up about their trauma or experiences once they left the relationship in fear of losing more support. It was also found that there are 3 specific barriers to disclosing their relationship, and those were listed as self-perception, past relationship experiences, and fear of repercussions of disclosure. To further discuss this properties of behavioral effects, intellectual impairments, and social and interpersonal challenges of a child, along with the health risk and barriers to disclosure that a woman of domestic violence faces, the ideal solution and awareness must be considered. It seems like too many women and children are being disregarded or ignored because not a lot of people know how to spot a victim of domestic violence. With DV being an ongoing health issue among children and women, there should be an effective support service that they can use to find shelter and feel a sense of belonging. Some helpful resources to domestic violence victims would be legal assistance to separate from the perpetrator, counseling to help figure out what type of mental and physical help they need, and shelter while they cannot afford another place to live, and some other sources that are specific to their unique needs. Preventative measures should also be in place to try and avoid these life-altering effects that domestic violence has placed on these individuals. I believe that there should be some recognition training in place within supportive services for domestic violence. While there is the CATS test available to test an individual on how much their social psychological adaptability has been affected, There should be awareness in place to prevent these tests from having to be conducted. To further the preventative measures, there should be a way for schools and job sites to implement a policy into their system to either report suspected domestic violence individuals, to keep an eye on their health, or to provide members with wellness check-ins. Moreover, there should be some educational resources that provide victims of domestic violence with an outlook to understand how their life still has purpose to it. Within this education should be resources that provide children with emotional and psychological support to help them through the behavioral tactics that have now been embedded in their brains. The intersectionality that many of these individuals face is very relative as well when it comes to their differences and experiences. That being said, there should be more educational recognition of each race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability, and socioeconomic status to better understand how each individual needs to be helped. So to evaluate my project, I think I could have done more of an extensive research outside of a single semester, and that would have been beneficial to truly understand the full potential that domestic violence has on children as well as women. But throughout all these findings, there was not one study that showed there was ever a positive effect on the children involved in a domestic violence situation. It was understood by me that the effects of domestic violence are always negative, and that proved my initial understanding before I began the research for this project. After I was done with this project, it also came to mind how it may have been resourceful to talk about what health services have been provided for children to overcome these behaviors and routines that have now become accustomed to their lives. It would be important to understand just how much research funding has been put into the lives of children who have been affected by domestic violence, considering the first thought that comes to mind when people think of domestic violence is how women are affected. Meaning, I think this will be important to research how much the lives of children are acknowledged in a domestic violence scenario, even if a woman or mother isn't involved. I would also like to consider the factor of what measures healthcare facilities are taking for the prevention of this ongoing health issue, being that the preventative measure was not a part of my findings. So the limitations that I ran into, the first one would have to be that there are laws set forth, such as HIPAA, that restrict the release of certain health information. So this could have restricted the true results of some studies. And then victims of domestic violence often face ongoing fear of endangerment, and research studies may put these individuals at risk for harm. This makes studying certain factors limited due to ethical stipulations behind them. Within these studies, there could also be limitation to how much was reported, just like how there was hesitation when it came to women disclosing their domestic violent relationship to their family or friends. There could also be bias in how much information they disclose to researchers when they are involved in a study. Another limitation that seems to be a relevant topic for this project was how each of these research articles do not state the specific type of violence that was involved within the studies that they completed. I think this would be important information to disclose, considering domestic violence can range from physical, sexual, psychological, emotional, and even economic abuse. Each of these different types of violence can vary in severity and duration, which in turn leaves different outcomes for the individuals that are a victim of it. Because of this factor, it makes conducting research for domestic violence quite a bit more complex, considering each case is unique. So the recommendations that I thought of, the first one that I thought of was how the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services needs to bring more awareness to the resources that they provide for intervention or prevention. If there's others like me, they would have known nothing about the domestic violence resource network that I mentioned in the introduction of this project. The DNVR is actually a great resource that provides the victims with a place to feel safe and gain knowledge of how to get out of their situation. So there should be more funding set in place for organizations like this throughout states and communities across the world, really, so that women and children will feel more seen and as if they can escape from the terrible circumstances that have been dealt to them. Overall, the negative effects that domestic violence places on children seems to be a very under-acknowledged corner in the world of healthcare and should be presented as more of a prevalent issue, especially today. The most important thing that I would recommend overcoming this is to implement training in schools so that members of the community are aware of the signs that domestic violence places on a child's behavior in social/interpersonal relationships. I also think that it would be beneficial to provide these children with the opportunity to speak up about this issue. And I say this because I know most women are aware of where they can confidentially tell their stories just based on the fact that a lot of restrooms includes pull-off tabs for them to use if they are ever in this type of situation. Children, however, do not have this resource and most likely are not confident enough or old enough to explain what has been happening to them and why they act the way they do. Thanks for listening to the negative effects that domestic violence places on children.